Hey everyone, David here with your weekly mouthful of David video. Like always, we'll start with updates before we get into the actual video. If you haven't heard yet, we started a Patreon. Patreon is a service where you are able to basically just pay your favorite creators, I guess you could call it. I think I always use a new term every single week whenever I describe it, but basically you can pay artists or makers of things that you like monthly donations. And so for us, we have $1 a month, $5 a month, and $8 a month tiers. And different tiers come with different bonuses. And all of that just goes toward podcast upkeep and paying our editor, Caroline, who is very good at what she does. So if you're able to give to that, that would be super appreciated. But if you're not able to, no worries. We just appreciate having you around. Other than that, our most recent episode is about the US coup in Iran in 1953. So if you haven't heard that yet, check it out. We have recently recorded a couple episodes about the Algerian War of Independence, so that'll be dropping at some point in the future. It's going to be a four-parter, so it is a bit of a doozy, but hopefully it's something that y'all will like, because for all the work that it was to put the series of episodes together, we, love history and we love recording it. So be on the lookout for that. And otherwise, we'll just jump into the video. So it is Women's History Month, and women's history is really important to study, but like with studying any other sort of specific group for history, it's not just that you're studying their history, because the history of any group is interwoven with the greater history of wherever you're studying. So studying women's history in the US isn't just studying women's history, it's studying US history, because if you're not acknowledging the role of women, then you're not really getting the full picture of what has happened through history in general. So I basically put together a reading list of 5 books about women's history in the US for people to check out. So the first one is Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. If you're not familiar with Angela Davis, she was a civil rights, she's still alive. She's an activist for civil rights, for racial and economic and gender justice. She is a very cool person, but also a scholar. I mean, she has a book, so of course, right? And Women, Race, and Class is a book about the history of the women's movement, but with race and class really integrated into the book as well. Hence the title. So just looking at the table of contents, for example, some of the first chapters have titles like The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood, The Anti-Slavery Movement and the Birth of Women's Rights, Class and Race and the Early Women's Rights Campaign. And so you have chapters like that. You have this focus in the book, again, where you're not just looking at the general women's rights movement, which, though very important and very cool, did often tend to center white middle-class women specifically. And so her book is looking at that history and being appreciative of it, but also including race and race and class analysis into the work. And so you learn about labor, you learn, again, like I mentioned, about slavery, and also racism after slavery. So you learn about the experiences of not just affluent white women, which is very important because, again, you want that big panoramic view of history. The next book I have is Women and the American Labor Movement by Philip Fauner. Philip Fauner, very cool historian. He was basically the ultimate American labor historian. He has, again, this book, Women in the American Labor Movement. He also has books about black workers in the labor movement and just a bunch of very, very cool things. In this case, women are workers. They are part of the working class, or at least, some of them are. And so it's really good to be able to get that history because labor is what built this country, and that includes the labor of women. And so again, going back to what I said before, if you're not giving credit to everyone and you're not looking at everyone's stories, then you only get part of the picture. And being able to focus in specifically on women as workers really kind of shows that. Because, there is a stereotype when you think of working class or when you think of blue collar workers, you only think of dudes. And to an extent, there's kind of a reason in the sense that a lot of the times women were kept from a lot of types of workplaces, but even when they're in the home, they're still laboring. But that being said, women have still been workers since the beginning of this country. And actually, a lot of the earliest labor actions in this country were led by women. So definitely check out this book. It is the longest book on this list. It's a bit of a tome, but very good reading. And of course, there's no one saying that you have to read every last page. Next is The Way We Never Were by Stephanie Coontz. And there's a lot that this book covers, honestly. I think the best way I can sum it up is to call it a history of the family, but really being done to dispel myths. And so just kind of looking at the back here, Leave It to Beaver was not a documentary. A man's home has never been his castle. The male breadwinner marriage is the least traditional family in history. So, that's the beginning sentence or part of it. It goes on. I don't want to read the whole thing and, take up 10 minutes just talking about this book. But again, it's about how family structures have changed throughout U.S. history, and the idea of the male breadwinner being the primary mover and controller of things is not really actually a traditional marriage. Neither is the nuclear family unit. And I'm talking about this book, of course, because, as I mentioned a second ago, even though women's history goes beyond the home, it's no secret that women have been forced into the home, sometimes because of their will, which is totally cool, but, sometimes because they are literally being forced there. And so you read about the history of family structures, and you see what has been kind of pushed onto women in a lot of ways. And so the book is really good about talking about gender. It also does include some stuff about race and class as well, talking about how, while affluent white women were in the home, often women of color and working class women were still working, whether working as domestic workers in pink-collar jobs or other, forms of labor. Experiences have varied, again, according to race and class within the greater umbrella of womanhood. So my last two books are actually kind of good complements to each other, so I'm going to mention them at once. And it is From Coveralls to Zoot Suits by Elizabeth Escovedo. And then City Girls, The Nice Social World in Los Angeles, 1920 to 1950. And they're very interesting glances into the experience of Latina women and Nisei or second generation Japanese American women, because they, first of all, went very different directions. Both groups have experienced racism and sexism throughout the history of this country and in other places as well. But during World War II specifically, Latina women as workers in factories actually got pretty decent economic chances by the standards of the time, which gave them some newfound freedom, but also came at some social costs and being kind of further stereotyped and kind of looked down upon for exercising some of the autonomy that they got during this time. Whereas for Nisei women, I mean, again, you're looking at 1920 to 1950, they're experiencing during the World War II years Japanese American internment. And so you have this kind of interesting case study of a specific moment of time for both of these groups during the World War II era. And what's kind of interesting about these books as well, and what kind of makes them even better pairs, is they use a lot of oral history, which I talked about in last week's video, where a lot of this is, of course, these books are consulting the normal sorts of sources that you would look at for any sort of history book. But there's really a heavy emphasis on oral history as well. And they're talking to women who, again, Japanese American women in Matsumoto's book and Latino women in Escovedo's book, talking to them and really getting a glimpse into their experiences. And so, it's good to just get a snapshot again of a certain time and understand the experiences of women, again, may vary. And that's hopefully something that these readings will really kind of leave as a takeaway, after you've checked out maybe a couple of them, is that women are a diverse group, obviously. I mean, they're roughly half of this country, right? They're roughly half of anywhere. And so just think about how not all women are alike. Think about how their experiences may vary, but ultimately, regardless, they should be celebrated. So thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good week, and I will catch you next time.